we're looking for the alternative to that wartime council mode that we seem to be chronically driven into. And instead of having that call to arms in politics, we'll have a call to the peace pipe.
All right, so we're going to talk politics. Right away, it's a very loaded term. A lot of negativity with that phrase. How often do we think that just means trying to convince someone who doesn't want to be convinced of something, and getting a lot of pushback, or being around the Thanksgiving table and just worrying that someone's going to start talking about election time or their favorite media source or cable news. It can be really a punishing experience. And we are a very polarized nation if we allow ourselves to be.
If whenever we think about that experience of family gatherings, Thanksgiving, as you say, that's usually what comes to mind, right? It's what we're afraid of. It's like that one uncle who has been spending a lot of time watching a certain, subscribe to a certain news channel, and all he wants to talk about is his latest theories about what's going on in the world of politics. And we sometimes find ourselves flummoxed about what to do, right? Do we engage? Do you try to change their mind? And I think we can all relate to how hopeless an experience it oftentimes feels, where you try to treat it as like a combat type situation of my side versus your side. Let me try my best to marshal all of my arguments and my evidence, everything I know about the subject, and try to bludgeon you into seeing the world the way I see it. But oftentimes it's fruitless. We end up feeling like it's not worth the effort. And so we can be very apathetic. We can kind of withdraw ourselves. And the problem is we start to have more and more of a restricted perspective on the world, where we only engage with those who see the world the way we do. It reinforces our opinion. It's what leads to a confirmation bias, a sense that we're only looking for evidence and information that confirms the beliefs we already have. So there's a real art to being able to engage in a healthy, productive conversation with someone who you know they don't share the same perspective that you do.
That's right. So we want to change your mindset about this, change the national dialogue. And the only way we do that is to start by looking from within. So talking politics evokes the rancor that we see on a debate stage. And it right away feels like the semantic space is populated by very polarized media sources and current events. People are always locked in on exactly what's happening right now this week in the news cycle and how contentious it is. And the media will gravitate toward the most emotional topics because they are engaging and interesting. The difficulty is we actually don't often want to talk about politics per se. That's not terribly fruitful as a conversation. And we want to really expand your sense that there's much more to talk about. So what we really want to get toward as Americans is our values, what we want to see from our leaders, what we want to see from our government, and take a very long-term perspective, over time. What do we want from the government that's going to be in place when our children are adults and voting? You can think of a much wider time horizon, and you can think about what you'd really like to see from our nation. And that's a lot that already starts to bring down the emotion level if you begin to think in a more long-term way with a goal of really bonding with another person, not convincing them of something that has to do with current events.
Yeah, I think that the metaphor that really evokes what this is all about is, instead of bridge burning, which happens a lot in politics. I mean, I can recall when first getting up to speed on the psychology of politics is how many people will defriend people on social media or cut themselves off from family members because of disagreements that they have about who to vote for or where they stand on different policy issues. And instead, we want to look at the possibility of bridge building with one another. And there's definitely an art to this, right? There's some aspects of it maybe where it can be a well thought out, structured way that can just be readily deployed like an algorithm, right? It just rinse and repeat, it works for every situation. But
and we want to change your algorithms because there's more than one that you can run.
Yeah, and the truth is it's a very fluid situation. You have to kind of embrace that aspect of political conversation. I think we can tell, at least I get this sense, when I'm engaging in a political conversation is very contentious, you get the sense that you're seeing a version of that person that's very well poised, put together, kind of like the script is already there for what they want to say about that issue. They're not really thinking and reasoning through it, because reasoning is kind of messy. It's a messy process of trying to figure out in real time, interrogate what you feel about this topic. How confident are you? Rinse and repeat, maybe taking a step back, and engaging in that sort of tightrope walk with another person. It's a great way to get to know yourself, get to know the other person. It's like engaging in a conversational adventure.
There's some important scientific aspects to reasoning that are worth pointing out. There's fluid reasoning, which is thinking on our feet, kind of if someone's throwing balls at us to juggle within our minds, that's fluid reasoning. So when you learn about some new situation or complex situation, you're having to think it through on the fly, and you're unprepared and you may stumble a little bit. You may drop a ball every now and again. Alternatively, there's crystallized reasoning, which is basically the sort of baked in phrases that we tend to use. Now, in political discussion, it almost always boils down to crystallized reasoning, because we're accumulating all of these bits of information from media sources, from the sort of polarized landscape discussion, and helplessly it sort of hardens within our mind like a crystalline structure. And then when someone brings up the dreaded word politics, right away, all of these crystallized scripts and what we call schemas, bodies of knowledge, kind of pop to the forefront. Oh, here we go again. We're going to talk about the latest election cycle. We're going to talk about the most controversial politicians. And so what we would encourage you to do is actually try to break out of that crystallized reasoning script-based mode. There's a different way, and this is what we have to engage in, is the reasoning mode. We want to get to that place where we're thinking in a fluid reasoning manner. And one of the best ways to do that is together. That is the reason to have a political discussion, or a discussion about our values and what we want to see from our country, if you don't want to call it politics per se. And I think we can do that, and you can sort of separate yourself from the national conversation. We point this out frequently. We're not running for office, and we're sure not running for a national party. So why do we always force ourselves into this script based on Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative? We can expand that conversation much more, make it less threatening, make it much more engaging, and actually really the goal should be trying to learn something through this fluid reasoning process. And if we do that, we can start to build crystallized reasoning structures that have a lot more positive tone and a lot more information about our fellow citizens baked in within our networks.
I think one thing that seems to fall short in this space, it's not like we're the first ones to ever mention that there should be an alternative, but it's really trying to sell. It's like a marketing problem. How do you make the alternative interesting and exciting? Because the combat metaphors that we're used to in politics, they're very enticing. The idea of being a warrior for your cause, right? Think back to our undergrad or high school English language arts class, where we learn about different kinds of narratives and stories, right? There's that man versus man idea, human versus human idea of politics, of this is my tribe versus your tribe. And most of us engage in that mode very naturally, without a second thought, as our default, because there's something very rewarding about this. To kind of bring a little bit of neuroscience into the perspective here, human beings need a sense of goal progress, a worthy goal to really excite us and motivate us. So that's when you get this dopamine response going, the sense of, well, I guess we're using our time productively. But whatever the alternative is, it has to take the form of the other types of narratives, the other types of stories that are just as exciting, the man versus himself idea, the man versus nature idea. And that's what we look at as being the alternative schemas or ways of viewing politics. It's not you versus the person you're talking to. It's both of you against maybe the baser aspects of our own nature, the parts of ourselves that are crying out for conflict, but instead being able to tamp down those passions and both build a bond, build a sense of community around a shared interest and curiosity over our sense to try to, our imperative to try to make a better world for ourselves. That's what we're trying to do when we're engaged in politics, and it's in the worthiest sense of the word.
So we really love analogies. I've studied analogies since grad school, and Michael and I have published on the use of analogies, and an analogy can be so powerful. And often, I think what happens with citizens just simply trying to discuss politics is the only analogy we can come up with is the two presidential candidates on a stage with microphones going at each other. And so if you kind of mindlessly fall into that script, you're playing out what you saw happen in the most contentious sort of trying to get the vote moment. And elections are really not where you're governing the country. You know, they're a lot. There's a lot of theater, and there's a wartime mindset. So Sebastian Junger, the author, talks about the wartime council or the wartime mindset versus the peacetime council. So in actual tribal situations, you would have those two ways of thinking. And the wartime mindset is exactly what happens on a debate stage. So we invite you to think about some other analogies that are more helpful. So if we are meeting just in a coffee shop and the discussion of like current events surrounding an election starts to come up, rather than thinking, I'm going to debate you right now and one of us has to win, a much better way is saying, let's engage in the shared struggle, that narrative where two people from maybe opposing tribes go on a shared quest for mutual betterment. And as a hiker, I will draw in our future discussions on the hiking analogy. So what you want to do in a good conversation is think about, you have a hiking partner and you can discuss what type of terrain you're going to encounter. It can be very perilous, boulder-strewn, gravelly terrain, and maybe with a very close, open attitude sort of conversation, you can get to that point. But you can also go on the terrain that's a little bit, maybe the paved path, just enters the woods to start with. And you can gradually grow and get into more interesting, difficult terrain, but you don't want to win over your hiking partner. You don't want to leave them in the dust. You want to nurture them along and have a shared experience. And that's what a good conversation can be. Make it like a hike where you depend on your partner depends on you. They bring different skills than you have, and you mutually benefit from the shared quest.
That's exactly right. And people are changed through these adventures. It's the reason why we engage in them. There's a bit of danger, there's drama involved. It's why we set camping trips or hunting trips with our companions. The idea is that you would be changed through this experience, not just as an individual, but with whatever bond or friendship it was that you brought there. It's changed. Now you've grown closer. You've learned to depend on each other. You've gained skills that you didn't have before because of the problems that you encountered, some of which you could have anticipated. That some you realized when it started raining on day 2 of the trip, oh, well, I guess we'll have to improvise. We'll have to build a shelter or something. These are the sorts of things that wind up being those sort of soul fortifying experiences that we really enjoy, not in the moment, but sort of in the rearview mirror when you look back on an adventure. And what we argue is that politics can be like this. I remember one of my favorite political conversations I had to do with universal basic income. The whole idea that all citizens should receive, another way of putting it is like Social Security for all, right? No matter what your age category is, you receive a check at the end of the month. This is a contentious issue. There have been some presidential candidates who've also voiced support for this policy issue. But what we realized, this friend of mine and I, as we're talking about it, it sort of meandered into a sidebar conversation about just the general question of how do human beings respond when given anything for free, right? When is
the nature of incentives?
The nature of incentives, exactly. And we both realized there's plenty of thoughts we both have on the subject, but we're also, just like everyone else, in sort of an exploration learning mode about this. No one has a monopoly on the truth with such grand, difficult philosophical questions, but it's a worthy challenge to engage in the struggle of mutually trying to bring both of your life experiences, all of the learning that you've acquired throughout your life, into that problem space, and end up in a strange way. It was a sort of bridge building experience, even though we both started off on opposite sides on this issue. We found ourselves kind of going through that conversation together, realizing, wow, we both learned a lot through this.
It is a leap of faith. Mm-hmm. It takes getting over that initial tension. Mm-hmm. When you sort of introduce some topic that's particularly a multi-sided topic that it's not always going to be a guaranteed positive conversation. And I feel as if it's in my own life, I'm trying to embrace that tension and use tools to kind of overcome the tension, to have that shared adventure. So another problem that we have, another analogy is that, very strident people on the right and on the left are the voices that need to be listened to. And moderates are sort of tepid in the middle and can't make their minds up. And that's also problematic because most of us are moderates. And we'll do a future discussion on this in which we talk about the fact that actually about 85% of Americans are somewhere in the middle. They may have a leaning one way or the other, but only about 15% of Americans are truly at the extremes of the two political parties. So if most people are moderates, guess what? The person you might engage with in dialogue at a restaurant or at a gathering, they're probably a moderate, meaning they hold opinions that you can talk about, right? They're not holding their politics as sacred on this untouchable hill because they must win an election. That isn't the way we should be thinking about the discussion of politics. And to your point about how there's a deep history to this, why it's satisfying to actually talk about ideas and values. Our brains did not evolve to handle universal basic income, the politics of managing 330 million Americans, the ownership of AK-47s. None of that was on the scene. Our brains evolved in a hunter-gatherer tribal past in which we track about 150 other individuals. It's the Dunbar number. And our brains are really wired to be able to manage, close, intimate, tribal interactions. And that's what our conversations hearken back to within human history. So we have these brains that evolved for tribal activities, hunting, gathering, getting along socially. And we're now using these same brains to try to manage these very complex policy positions in a very diverse nation. And so it's very helpful to kind of roll back the clock in your own head. What if we were just around a campfire? There's maybe a mammoth off in the distance. And we're just going to talk. And just going to talk about our goals for life and in the journey ahead. That's the mindset that you can get into with other Americans. It's remarkable what can happen when you sort of set the stage differently in that manner.
And I think it's the most exciting aspect of living in a democracy. I mean, oftentimes we just think about voting as being the hallmark of living in a democracy, right? Having one's voice heard, one person, one vote, that idea. But, thinking about a more expansive notion of citizenship with more grandeur attached to it is this idea that we have the privilege to be able to talk about these subjects openly and freely and to be able to explore. There's so many ways of seeing every issue that you can think of. And I think it's a matter of embracing that freedom that we've been afforded as a privilege of those of us who have that sort of opportunity. And it's one that we shouldn't forego. It's one we should look to with enthusiasm. And so with coming with the next set of episodes, we're hoping to explore different facets of this issue when it comes to how we think about politics, how we resolve disputes, and what are the specific tactics that we can use when we encounter flashpoints, when it seems that emotions are getting a little too heated. How can we damp down those tensions in order to right the ship? Kind of akin to, again, being on a hiking trip and you're finding that the rocky path that you're on, there's some loose gravel there, and you have to regain your footing. Just as there are skills and tactics for those types of scenarios, so too there are types of contingency plans that you can build in place when you engage in a conversational adventure.
I like how you said conversational, because that's what we strive for in these episodes. There's a reason we don't put a lot of graphs up or cutaways or animations. We just really want to have that face-to-face conversation with all of you who are watching this, because that is where it is at for the human brain. We are social primates, and we gain so much from seeing the expressions of other people. And we would be remiss without mentioning the effects of social media and posting and depersonalized communication, because they're very evident. We don't really need to get into how toxic that can get, because it brings out the worst in people when they can't bond with someone. There's no opportunity to see the reaction, the facial expression, and there's no expected relationship that they're trying to nurture, whereas in person. And I just had thrown out a few ideas: meeting someone at a gathering, meeting someone at a coffee shop, maybe even meeting a rather distant relative or potential a friend that is currently an acquaintance. You are in the business of relationship building. And that's really the mode that is going to depolarize this nation: more face-to-face conversation. Because in the face-to-face conversation, you have a different goal. It's really to explore together. It's to bond. It's not to shut one another down and win, because the only thing you achieve there is alienating somebody. And in social psychology, there's a lot of work on persuasion, and the way not to persuade someone effectively is to just try to crush them with facts, figures, and hostility and raising your voice. You're usually going to intimidate that person and make them very uninterested in that exploratory mindset that we've talked about being so important. So the first step, I think, is really to overcome your initial fears. And the way to do that is to remember this is a shared journey. Now, not everyone wants to take a hike. Some people want to go take a nap in the car.
Yeah.
That's okay too. You can back out of a conversation. You don't have to take the journey with someone, but if you offer the chance to, you can both learn. And I think that's, for the brain, learning is one of those really potent experiences, and it's one of the reasons people do engage with one another just on a daily basis. And we want to help you embrace that spirit.
Exactly. We're looking for the alternative to that wartime council mode that we seem to be chronically driven into. And instead of having that call to arms in politics, we'll have a call to the peace pipe, so to speak. This idea that we can cultivate an art and science of conversation as something of a virtue of our citizenship. And that's what we hope to fashion and craft through these coming episodes, is ways to become more and more adept as conversational partners with our friends and our family and others we hope to break bread over the conversations in politics.
Yep, it all starts with changing your mindset, using a different analogy, and then go out in the world and do something with it.